But taking ourselves back from these relationships and healing means a multi-step process of pulling ourselves out of these relationships, of unshaming our own feelings, of finding safe spaces and ways to express them, away from the narcissistic person, obviously, and learning what our feelings are and how to be with them. And then that takes us to my little aphorism: healing is feeling. Have you ever said to yourself, oh, I allowed this to happen? When you're thinking about your narcissistic relationship, you may look at a mess or an argument and say, yeah, this is my fault. I let all of this happen. Let's talk a little bit about that shame that people feel when they believe that the whole mess that's been created by a narcissistic relationship is something that you allowed to happen. So many survivors look at the wreckage of any kind of narcissistic relationship, especially if the relationship has gone on for a long time. And beyond just the head shaking, the sadness, the anxiety, the anger, the rumination, the helplessness, there's often another sentiment that I allowed this to happen, right? When survivors tell me this, and many, many do, I do look sideways at them and say, come on again, you allowed what to happen? They will reiterate, I allowed this to happen. I allowed this mess to grow and hurt other people because I stayed, because I tried to fix it, because I believed that they would change, because I chose them in the first place, right? That's what they believe. So in essence, when a person says that I allowed this to happen, they are saying that I am responsible for this mess because I actually tried to make this relationship work, because I gave this person a second chance, because I forgave them, because I believed that they could change. Then the survivor goes a bridge too far, and in essence, by saying, I allowed this to happen, is basically taking responsibility for another person's toxic behavior, which is what most survivors within narcissistic relationships do. I have witnessed people do this in long-term committed relationships and marriages. I have witnessed people do this with family members. I have witnessed people do this in workplaces. They look at the mess and they believe, it's me. I'm the one who allowed this to happen. I do not know what magical spell that people with antagonistic personalities cast upon most of us, that we are willing to look at the damage created by them and say that we allowed it to happen. In essence, taking on the complicity and blame for a mess that was originally generated by their dysregulation, their lack of empathy, their blame shifting. The story of an antagonistic or a narcissistic relationship is much easier to tell backwards than forwards. While people are in it, and especially before they understand what narcissism is and how it works in relationships, typically they follow the party line. Try harder, communicate harder, forgive, take responsibility, hope they can change yourself instead, right? One day you read something or watch something or listen to something and learn that, wait a minute, this thing I'm in, this doesn't really change. There isn't much that you can do about it. And once all the things that our narcissism is, once those soak in, you recognize that for years, you were driving down the wrong road. You didn't allow anything to happen. In most cases, many people in these relationships actually treat the person with this kind of personality style as you would a person with a kinder, healthier, nicer personality style. You thought they were having a bad day. You didn't allow anything to happen. You treated them with an expectation of goodness, with compassion, the same compassion you would grant to other people. When we talk to ourselves this way and say things like, I allowed this to happen, I'm to blame in part for this, what we've done is we've internalized their gaslighting. We've also internalized that sentiment that other people have, that wonder why we couldn't make it work. You didn't allow anything to happen. They did what they do. and they did it to your detriment. You were simply in the splash zone of their cruel behavior. It's important you don't keep falling in the "I allowed this to happen" kind of language, because that kind of language starts to bleed into other areas of your lives. We become our own abusers. We blame ourselves for the abuse we receive from others. We blame ourselves from the abuse that the antagonistic people in our lives propel onto others. I know it is painful when children are involved and you feel responsible for having children with a toxic person and ending them up with a difficult parent. But you didn't allow it to happen. In most cases, you didn't know, or at least you didn't know until you were well into the relationship. All the time wasted in high school and college on classes we will never use. Imagine if there was one on red flags and manipulation. That should have been a required class. We're just not taught any of this. It's absolutely crucial for survivors to find kinder ways to talk to yourselves. It is an essential part of healing. And no, you didn't allow this to happen. Allowing something to happen implies you gave it permission. At no point did you actually consent and sign up for somebody to do this much harm to you. It happened, and if nothing else, your nervous system was so transfixed by the mess that was unfolding around you. It wasn't about allowing. It was about what happens when a person's behavior, and this is the case with most narcissistic folks, never has consequences. Where healing levels up to the place where it's the shift in narrative, rewriting your story, taking it back from the narcissistic person, and no longer giving them such a central role. As the fog lifts, and as the grief becomes less overwhelming, it's time to start talking about forgiveness, right? And let me tell you, that is one hell of a loaded word in the world of narcissistic relationships. Most people think forgiveness is great. Some people even think it's necessary. They believe it sets us free, that it's noble, that it shows us that we are somehow evolved, that we have released the person who harmed us, that we aren't sidled with the poison of what they did to us. But that, however, that kind of thinking is based on a model of forgiveness that assumes that the person you forgive receives it as a call to action to be better, a place to make amends, to change their ways, and to engage in behaviors that leave you or whomever they harmed feeling safer again. When we forgive and that happens, sign me up. I'm all about forgiveness. None of us are perfect. To be forgiven for our missteps and then to receive that forgiveness as a gift, as a place to become better, to be more mindful, to not keep making the same mistakes, that is how forgiveness is supposed to work. But then there's the world of narcissistic relationships. It's like an upside down world where the fundamental rules of human relationships no longer apply, where everything we were taught kind of goes upside down, where the world defends, or at least enables or excuses, the behavior of the person who continually psychologically and emotionally harms their partner or family member or friend, but who never gets called out themselves. Where no matter how much empathy you show, it is not enough. Where no matter what you do, it's not enough. I mean, let's face it. When we're told, oh, somebody's not forgiving, the picture we hold of a non-forgiving person is of an angry, bitter, resentful, dark-hearted, grudge-holding, inflexible, closed-hearted person, right? To me, actually, that sounds like a vulnerable narcissist. But let's face it. When people who have been profoundly and repeatedly hurt by someone who shows no signs of changing, who keeps doing the same harmful things and justifying them, or tells you that you are too sensitive for reacting to them, or gaslights you about them, I don't know how dark-hearted and bitter that is if you choose not to forgive that. The research shows that forgiving serial abusers, people who repeatedly do bad things and don't change even after you forgive them, it's not good for your well-being or your sense of self. It's like survivors of narcissistic relationships need one more damn thing to hurt their sense of self, right? That to keep on forgiving and to have them keep transgressing, it's simply not good for you. I don't think that makes you a dark, cold person to not forgive them. I think it makes you smart. And I'm telling you, I've seen the internet mob, especially the toxic positivity self-development space, cruelly attack people who will own up to the fact that they don't forgive someone. I've seen it happen firsthand. And those attackers never stop to learn the backstory behind that person's lack of forgiveness or unwillingness to forgive. The pressure, both by the larger social mob, by families, by groups of friends, by workplaces, it's strong. And it can be really hard to withstand, especially if you feel as though you are being held back by your own sense of self-doubt, with the narcissistic person's gaslighted assertions that you are the problem, that you are unkind for not forgiving them. This can mean that lots of folks in narcissistic relationships will give in to this forgiveness pressure. And that's absolutely understandable. You give in because you're empathic. To not be rejected out of hand as being mean people who are forgiving, that's why you give in, because you're not a mean person. Because if you don't give in to the forgiveness pressure, then you might actually lose a larger community of people. This can result in what we can only call a sort of non-consensual forgiveness. It's pressured. People forgive so they can keep fitting in. We may also forgive while we are in these relationships because trauma bonding is real. And as much as we have been hurt and recognize that this was not okay, forgiveness may represent a clean slate, a chance for a fresh start, a sort of betrayal blindness meets forgiveness is good, meets trauma bonded, thank goodness I don't have to leave yet, meets the normal human hope for love and attachment. Narcissistic people love forgiveness, right? They love that there's a sort of dry erase board that just gets wiped away, and they just keep getting to do their things, right? It's the ultimate setup for them because they actually feel entitled to that. So when they are forgiven, it fits their schema of the world. They're special. There shouldn't be consequences. Of course they should be forgiven, right? Most people in narcissistic relationships spend a long time forgiving. Years, lifetimes. It's what we were taught to do. We were indoctrinated into it. It's what you were raised on. And each time you do it, and the narcissistic person doesn't change, and we know they're probably not going to change, it can feel you feeling foolish, like you were played, helpless, hopeless, angry, frustrated, let down. People who write this positivity, self-development books about the joys of forgiveness and how it sets you free, I don't believe that they've been in a relationship with a narcissistic person who keeps breaking their heart again and again, and least of all a narcissistic person that they can't easily get away from. There are Instagram accounts and all sorts of programs focused on forgiveness. I got to tell you, it's a good brand. And it becomes a space where so many survivors of narcissistic relationships feel shamed. Either you keep doing it repeatedly and you get burned, or you don't do it and you get shamed for being cold and unforgiving. You might get called unempathic. You might even get called narcissistic. I have witnessed people who have said, I can't forgive them anymore. They have done too much harm. And then the family system around them would say something like, well, now look at you, who's unempathic now? Ain't that the pot calling, and you know all the rest of it, right? But let's face it, we are so focused on this conversation about forgiving the narcissistic person that we put that ahead of forgiving ourselves. And you may wonder, what exactly is it that we need to forgive ourselves for? Well, most of you who are survivors, you blame yourselves for not being enough, for being too extra, for asking too much, for being disloyal, for being mean, for choosing the narcissist, for being angry at parents and family members who invalidated you. You have to forgive yourselves, because to feel angry, hurt, betrayed, and then wanting to see these folks clearly and understand it, that's your salvation. If you are hell-bent on forgiving them, you do that, but you got to forgive yourself first. You do that, then we can talk about forgiveness. In the book, I call all of this, that entire section of this book is called The Treachery of Forgiveness. And let me tell you, it's a treacherous space in these relationships, whether you choose to forgive or not, or choose not to know, and perhaps down the road, whatever you choose, it's your call. But if when you finally, whatever you decide around forgiveness, I don't care if you do or you don't, but it's got to be from a place that feels authentic and whole to you. If you forgive and then stop forgiving, or if you don't forgive and then you do forgive, or if you never do, all of those options are great. You do what feels authentic for you. Just don't fake it. And just as an FYI, don't feel the need to tell them or anyone else that you don't forgive the narcissist. This is an experience you can hold internally. And whether you do or you don't, always remember that you can heal. Forgiveness is optional. Here's a new Dr. RAMANI truism. I want you to really listen to this and feel this one because it came out of me and I think it's all the truth you need to know. Healing is feeling. I know that's a little bit cutesy and a little bit too warm and fuzzy for the good old Dr. R, but I'm claiming this one and making this a sort of central healing quote for people experiencing narcissistic relationships and narcissistic abuse. It kind of came out of me spontaneously as I was talking with an audience, and afterwards, a few folks in the audience said just that phrase helped them, so here we are. Feeling is sort of forbidden in narcissistic relationships. Our feelings definitely make the narcissistic people in our lives uncomfortable. Our feelings may evoke shame in them. They may be put off or have contempt for what they perceive as being human weakness. They may view feelings as an inconvenience. Whatever their reasons, if we show emotion in a narcissistic relationship that the narcissistic person doesn't quite agree with, then we will face their negative emotions, frankly, invalidation, rage, shaming, dismantling of our reality. If you were raised with a narcissistic parent, you were in essence indoctrinated into learning to shut your emotions down or otherwise to face the shaming, mockery, or anger of a parent. When it starts that young, we start to learn that feeling is a very risky space, and you become trained to shut feelings down, to not show them, or maybe even find other ways to express them that may end up harming yourself. Now, in narcissistic relationships, there is one emotion they express, and they express a lot. And I know you know the answer to this. That's anger. Ultimately, all of their emotions seem to be like roads that all feed into anger. Shame is expressed as anger. Emotions, the narcissistic person is feeling, they may equate that with weakness. Those feelings could be anxiety or depression. Those evoke more shame and then anger. So even if the narcissistic person has another emotional experience, it always ends up expressed as anger. So the prevailing emotional state of a narcissistic relationship is anger. And their anger sort of shuts down all other emotional expression. Basically, all the emotions really become anger. And as a result of this, people in narcissistic relationships often feel that they're caught up in something that almost feels like a form of dissociation. Having to do that much emotional silencing means that feelings get separated from. And while that is completely understandable, it doesn't work once healing begins. And yes, not feeling can be more comfortable than the tidal wave of emotion that feelings can bring, the mix of grief and anger and sadness. It's a very uncomfortable mix of feelings that often prevail in these relationships. But the one thing you have to remember about feelings is that they happen, and life happens, and feelings are a part of life, and the feelings change over time, and the feelings in and of themselves are not a bad thing. Feelings are little messengers, and being able to watch them and hold them and name them and recognize them and care for ourselves in the midst of them and not be scared by them, all of that's a good thing. Recognizing that our feelings don't define us. You may feel angry. That doesn't mean you're an angry person. In narcissistic relationships, feelings get a bad rap because they're pathologized by the narcissistic person. We're ashamed for them. If we receive feelings, we experience feelings and express them appropriately, that's a game changer. If we are sad, we feel it. We give ourselves a moment to slow down, be kind to ourselves, maybe reach out for help, or do something we know we are good at or enjoy. But above all else, recognize, just like all feelings, sadness is going to pass too. All of that changes things. I know any of you who have ever watched Inside Out, you know that joy needed sadness, right? It's how it works. Even people who are not in narcissistic relationships struggle with feelings. But taking ourselves back from these relationships and healing means a multi-step process of pulling ourselves out of these relationships, of unshaming our own feelings, of finding safe spaces and ways to express them, away from the narcissistic person, obviously, and learning what our feelings are and how to be with them. And then that takes us to my little aphorism, healing is feeling. If you are a survivor of narcissistic relationships and you are feeling, then as miserable as it may be, it's a good thing. You are alive. You're human. Things happen to you. And if you are feeling them, it means that you are connecting back to yourself. That day you start crying and you can't stop, my only wish for you is that you have a spot to do it and perhaps some support so you can keep crying, because on the other side of that big cry are more feelings and more life where you get to feel and be you. Narcissistic relationships steal so much from us, our sense of self, our sense of competence, our sense of goodness, our sense of trust in ourselves. And they also steal our sense of safety in our own emotions. As we climb back into all of this, into our emotions, confusing and painful that it is, the pain, the feeling, that's the win. So if you are starting to feel, it does really mean that you are healing. I know it doesn't feel good. I remember when my mom had a surgery and she started feeling all these tingly feelings in her hands again, and she got scared by them. And then when I took her to the doctor, they said, the pressure has actually been lightened up. The signals are sending. Those nerve cells, they were alive. It didn't feel good. Still doesn't feel great, but it's there, and she's slowly able to do more things with her hands. The healing is the feeling. And so, you know me, I am not up for cutesy sayings, but this one, it kind of came out of me, and then the more I sat with it, and the more I applied it to thinking about folks I've worked with, people I continue to talk to, this one holds some weight. So if you're feeling, it does feel scary as hell, because think about what's always happened to us when we've felt our emotions. But if you are feeling them, I promise you, this means you're going in the right direction. And just like mom with those painful hands, little by little, it gets a little bit better, but it means things are alive and they're coming back, and you'll come back too. So I was reading something the other day about adverse childhood experiences, which is the term we use to describe the things that can happen to a person in childhood, such as various forms of abuse and neglect, including physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, exposure to substance misuse by witnessing adults in the household doing that, exposure to mental illness in others in the home, suicidal behaviors by others in the home, or suicidal ideation by caregivers, exposure to domestic violence, incarceration of family members, particularly their caregivers, as well as other things that might be happening outside of the home, including things like bullying, community violence, the aftermath of natural disasters, refugee experiences, war, just adversity in all of its forms. Now, generally and statistically, these adverse childhood experiences are associated with a variety of poor outcomes for the child who experienced them going into adulthood. And these can include chronic health problems, mental health issues, a greater likelihood of unhealthy behaviors such as smoking or drug or alcohol use, and even social outcomes such as having problems with steady employment or issues doing well in school, right? So I was reading a transcript of a conversation between doctors Bruce Perry and Gabor Mate about adverse childhood experiences. This was part of my preparation. I'm about to give a big lecture on narcissistic parents and adverse childhood experiences, so I'm studying everything I get my hands on, right? And there was an interesting observation they made in their interview. Simply saying, just the simple statement that adverse childhood experiences are bad and that's that, Dr. Perry pointed out that it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. That what happens to us in adulthood is actually very multi-determined. And from a probability standpoint, certainly adverse childhood experiences are not good. And we absolutely must protect children in these circumstances, or ideally prevent the adverse childhood experience from happening in the first place. But it's not a fatalistic determination. It's not a guarantee that everything's going to go badly for that child as an adult. He pointed out that social connectedness is protective, and that in people who had better outcomes after experiencing adverse childhood experiences, the social connectedness is what protected them. So following this line of reasoning, one thing I found as I prepared for this lecture, clearly from the literature, narcissistic parenting is associated with a higher risk for adverse childhood experiences, including emotional abuse, physical abuse, emotional neglect, a general lack of attunement and awareness of their own children, a role reversal with children being expected to anticipate their parents' needs and to care for and attune to the parent, right? So let's get back to that social connectedness part, because I come back to this time and time again when I talk about healing from narcissistic relationships, that it's our strongest tool for becoming more gaslight resistant, narcissism resistant, to manage the grief after narcissistic abuse, and most importantly, to heal and grow into our authentic selves. The social connectedness piece is essential to healing, and it connects to what they were talking about. The fact that the social connectedness matters so much is good to know, but can also feel quite disheartening for survivors who may have become so isolated in these relationships or family systems that they don't have these people, the socially connected people in their lives, and don't know how to start finding these people. Listen, there's lots of places to begin. Even one friendship is a place to start. Start giving that one friendship the care and nurturance that would allow it to benefit both of you, and start growing that relationship more and sharing and listening to them. If you have connections to healthy colleagues, build out those relationships more. Even if your conversations are just about work, at least if they see you clearly, that makes a difference. Take a class. Explore offerings in your community. Seeking out mental health care can also be a place to work on this, and also start having the experience of a healthy, validating experience or relationship with someone where you are seen and attuned to. Group therapy can also be a great place to not just get mental health support, but also connect with other people who are going through something similar to you, and support groups, and those are often far more affordable or even free. And while virtual communities may not always feel as fulfilling as relationships in real life, they're an important place to start. And I see the power of support in online forums of people who are good, compassionate, reasonable, self-aware, and simply kind. As long as they're well moderated, that can happen. Narcissistic relationships, by definition, are isolating. Either the narcissistic person literally isolates you, or they are so critical of people that you know that you don't bring people around, or they are judgmental of how your time is spent. So you may stop doing that, or you are ashamed of your relationship, so you don't connect to people, or your sense of self-worth erodes in a way that you don't feel confident meeting new people, or it's all of the above. It's not easy. And starting small is essential, because the support matters. For years, you have been looking into the equivalent of a funhouse mirror that distorted how you are seen and reflected back. Simply spending an hour with someone who listens, who reflects back, who sees your goodness, who tracks the conversation, all of it, it can feel like a rebirth. And as Dr. Perry suggests, it becomes a place to remain resilient against any number of childhood wounds. Narcissistic relationships and the harms that they cause proliferate in the dark, where we have no validating voices or supports. It is one of the single most powerful healing tools. And while it is hard to get there, you start with one good person and you go from there. You don't need lots. This isn't about having a brigade of 25 folks around you. Even 1, 2, 3 people, relationships where it's a give and take, a back and forth. You simply feel taller and stronger after spending time in healthy relationships. And it becomes a self-sustaining system. These relationships, these healthy relationships where you're seen and felt, are the equivalent of turning on the lights. In the film Gaslight, the old school original film, the thing that set her free, the woman being gaslighted, was that one person showed her what was going on. Sometimes it just takes one. We waste so much time knocking ourselves out to be what the narcissistic person wants, and we get so little back. Being present in healthy relationships actually gives you more energy and creates fertile ground for more healing. Always sharing the evidence when it comes up. Our pasts are not our destinies, and that there are wells we can draw upon to strengthen ourselves and stay strong in the face of what has happened to us. I was so glad I stumbled onto their conversation because it highlights what we know happens for people in narcissistic relationships. You can't do this alone, and I promise you that someday you will be this to someone else. In so many cases, you already are. I know this is the hardest part of healing, is finding those people, but you will. Remembering that by definition, narcissistic relationships leave us isolated can sort of help us remember why they can have such negative effects. But to understand that that social connectedness may be what stops this from kind of hurtling out of control and getting more and more severe in terms of the impact on you is such an important thing to know. Have any of you ever said, okay, I can't leave this narcissistic relationship, but damn, I need a break. I wish I could just get a break? That's what we're going to talk about today. That idea of the kind of break you could use from a narcissistic relationship. And sometimes when we're talking about other people in tough circumstances, it's called respite care. So let's talk about respite care as it might apply to people experiencing narcissistic abuse. Now, one thing about narcissistic abuse is that it is a pattern where the people around the person with this unhealthy pattern, actually, basically with narcissism, actually experience more harm than the narcissist themselves, right? So the people experiencing the narcissistic abuse experience more harm. Now, with most mental health issues, we do tend to focus on the person experiencing the issues, depression, anxiety, whatever it may be. But narcissism's a different beast, right? It's a personality style. And the bulk of the harm comes to those who are near the narcissist. And again, generally not the narcissistic person themselves, who tends to often just be living the life of Riley, never having to take responsibility for anything. Now, I was talking to folks the other day about managing the stress of taking care of themselves when they were taking care of somebody else. For example, if somebody who's taking care of somebody who is, I don't know, living with serious medical problems or pretty serious mental illness or dementia or some other needs that require heavy caregiving. Now, we know there's an existing literature that really goes into depth on caregiver burden, and it looks at people who may be caring for or living someone, like I said, with dementia or a physical illness, or someone who may be caring for someone who may be differently abled, or someone who may have a substance use disorder. What we know about that is that people in these situations where they're having to do heavy caregiving are often quite tired and may feel a sense of helplessness, mental exhaustion. They may feel anxious and burned out, and they have to deal with all kinds of systems such as insurance and healthcare providers. They may also have their own paid jobs and have to be taking care of kids or something like that. And just the heavy lifting of taking care of another person is a lot. Now, interestingly, in some situations, people who are experiencing caregiver burden may sometimes receive something called respite care. It's often in the form of someone who comes in and gives that caregiver a few hours or even more of a break so that the person can get out and maybe get a night out or a day of errands or even something like a weekend away. It's meant to replenish the caregiver so they can come back and take on the challenges a little bit more refreshed and clear-headed. It's usually granted when someone is caring for someone who has medical or something like memory care needs, and it might be paid for or provided by an agency or some other entity designed to support folks so their family member can be taken care of at home. Now, when I thought about that, when I was having this conversation about respite care, it left me wondering, what would respite care look like for someone in a narcissistic relationship? What would that mean? Because I know that in most cases, when a person's in a narcissistic relationship, they may not be taking care of them, but because folks with narcissistic personalities require so much reassurance, so much validation, so much supply, so much for things to be their way, even to the detriment of others, that anyone who has to live with them or has to put up with them may actually feel as though they are engaging in some form of caregiving. Oh, having to haul all that heavy validation into the room, even when you're exhausted, is no different than feeling as though you're having to haul someone up the stairs or carry laundry all over the house. I would actually say that actually hauling laundry and trash is much easier than having to constantly deliver validation to a narcissist. But let's face it, folks, there is no such thing being provided as respite care for narcissistic abuse, obviously. There is no agency I can think of that provides this. But what if we were to design it? What would respite care for folks experiencing narcissistic abuse look like? Because it may be something that we need to do for ourselves. Now, as I see it, it would be a place or a time where a person is not minimized, where they're not gaslighted, and where they're supported. In fact, where they are validated and their reality is supported. Where they are encouraged to try new things and laugh out loud, and their courage is built up. Where the conversation is actually about them for a minute and they aren't interrupted. A place where they can trust people and not worried about being lied to every minute. Where they can eat what they want without it being criticized and go to sleep when they want without someone starting an argument at bedtime or first thing in the morning. And I got to tell you, if I ever win the lottery, I think I'm going to create a narcissistic abuse respite center. I could use one myself. And all of these things would happen for survivors. So I'll keep buying those lottery tickets. But alas, such a place right now does not exist. However, maybe you could try and craft your own version, a day or a weekend with friends who do these things for you, and where you might feel comfortable asking for these things ahead of time, like, hey, can I talk without interruption? Maybe it would just be time alone, even a night in a local hotel where you get to call the shots on your life for one night. Even calling the shots means eating cheesecake in bed while watching bad reality TV and then sleeping in. Perhaps it's a long drive where you are in charge of the music player or can listen to the kooky podcast you love without it being criticized, and then take yourself for lunch at the place that serves the food that the narcissistic person in your life never wants to eat. Maybe it's an extra day you quietly tack onto a business trip just to get a break. You just tell them the trip is lasting a day longer, and then take advantage of already being gone, right? Now, if you have someone in your life, you're supporting a survivor of narcissistic abuse, maybe you can create a sort of mini respite care for them. Either make it possible for them to get away for a day by watching their kids or their pet, or taking them someplace and ensuring that you listen to them and let them set the plan for the weekend or the day. Now, you may be dealing with or know someone who might be dealing with familial narcissistic abuse, where the person may not live with their family of origin, but any time spent with their parents takes a toll on them. So then you could offer to accompany them to soften the stress, or you can offer to sit with the most difficult family members so that the person you know who's in that family can manage the other issues in the family system. I've had people do that for me, and it's really helpful. The struggle with this is, of course, that after any respite care of any kind, the person does have to return to their original responsibilities. In the case of caregiving, that's going to happen, or have to return back to the narcissistic situation. But these moments of respite care aren't a cure. They are meant to replete and restore just a little bandwidth so a person can strengthen themselves and maybe be a little more resolute in the face of what is happening to them. Respite care isn't a one-off. It is something that has to be done on a somewhat regular basis, even if it's just every couple of months. When I think about what anyone needs when they are feeling broken down by a difficult caregiving situation, I recognize that this is something a person in a narcissistic relationship would also need. By thinking of it as respite care, it can help a person think of it as an essential restoration to stay strong. And hopefully, with that strength, get a little better at boundaries and slowly disengage from the manipulative landscape that is the narcissistic relationship. If you have any other ideas on what respite care could look like, drop them in the comments, if for no other reason that other people can read about it. But like I said, when it comes to other mental health situations or physical health situations, we're so invested in helping caregivers anywhere we can and any way we can. But we don't think about that with survivors of narcissistic abuse. We often just paint it as, oh, that's just a tough relationship. It's a lot more than that. And people in these relationships, especially when they can't get out of them, which is a lot of folks, every so often, you just need a break. Thanks again.